The capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife by the U.S. military has triggered a profound international crisis, pitting the Trump administration's narco-terrorism justification against a wave of global condemnation. Leading the opposition, South Africa and the UN have characterized the raid Operation Absolute Resolve as a dangerous breach of international law, while Washington maintains the intervention was a lawful exercise of its authority. Let's unpack this further with Gustavo de Carvalho from the South African Institute of International Affairs. A very good afternoon to you, Gustavo. Thanks very much for your time. We had yesterday that UN Security Council session where, of course, the U.S. defended its decision. Needless to say, you had a whole host of other nations differing with it over what it has happened. And you had President Maduro's government also dismissing everything that the United States had raised and what it also said at yesterday's meeting. The point, or what people have been asking, was whether that particular session did or will make any difference.
Thank you so much, and I think at this stage it's a reasonable concern to have. We've seen the UN Security Council in the last years really struggling to present its position as the primary international organ to deal with threats to international peace and security. And if we're looking to how the UN itself defines the idea of aggression, it is very clear that what happened was the use of armed forces by a particular state against the territorial integrity of another country. I think the issue here is not so much in terms of whether it is legal or illegal as an action from what we've seen the United States doing in Venezuela. I think in reality it brings another crisis to the UN that has faced and it's facing some of its most difficult legitimacy crisis. It is pretty unlikely the Security Council will be able to actually make any direct action towards that. But I think it is important in the sense of providing the international community the opportunity and the space to really look into what is the type of international organizations that we want and need. If it in situations like this, where the Security Council is really not able to respond, as it wasn't able to respond in the case of Palestine, as it wasn't able to respond in the case of Ukraine, I think it is a very worrying territory that we have entered now, where the United Nations becomes even less credible in dealing with international crisis.
But which then led to many people even questioning whether we still need or whether there's a point in still having a United Nations which effectively, though not wittingly, still or has the impact or its inability to deal adequately with situation, then perhaps unwittingly forces it to rubber stamp, basically, ideas that are widely rejected, precisely because the organs like your Security Council are inherently undemocratic. One country stands up and vetoes, and that's it, and that's the end of the issue, which then means the United Nations remains impotent.
Absolutely, and I think that is certainly something that we need to be very concerned about. We understand that while the United Nations is very limited and very weak in many of the circumstances, particularly when you have one of the permanent members of the Security Council itself accused of violation of the rules that they have created. Whether we're talking about Russia, whether we're talking about the United States, those reduce the credibility and the ability of the organ really to respond to so many of these crises. I think there is two aspects of that is important for us to remember. I think the first one is that there is still a lot of important work that the Security Council provides, whether it's in terms of peacekeeping operations in different parts of the world, whether it's in terms of even broader UN roles through UN agencies, through the broader UN system, that does provide important role in terms of development, in terms of human rights, whether it's climate and so on. But I think the second aspect is that it does bring an important space for countries that have been demanding for decades that the Security Council needs reform, that we need to find different ways and different mechanisms that makes it not only more representative to different parts of the world, but also in a way that makes it more effective, that it allows the institution to respond when it's able to. And noticing the limitations that international organizations have. International organizations are as strong as its members allow them to be. And clearly, when some of the strongest members, like the United States, incur in actions like the ones we've seen in Venezuela in the last few days, that really reduces even more the trust that it's created internationally on its own ability. So it certainly brings an important space of reflection and an important space of action for changes within the United Nations.
But will that ever happen? Because, I mean, reform calls have fallen on deaf ears. And part of the problem, well, certainly from where I sit, but what do I know, is that those who wield a lot of power, in other words, the nations that have veto power, have no interest in giving that up. And for me, that seems to be where things then get stuck. And there's no way out of this situation unless and until those superpowers are magnanimous enough or care as much about the world as they claim to be. I know this is a difficult conversation to have in the context of what has happened to President Maduro, but isn't that a big part, at least, of the problem?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think when we look into institutions like the UN, we need to understand that these institutions are limited by design. They are limited by design in the sense of you need the countries to be able to agree to these rules that we're going to be following through. And if we don't follow those rules, there would be implications for that. We don't really have some kind of a global police that can really control what decisions that are being made. However, I think there is an important aspect of we can let as the international community see the United Nations Security Council fall apart and not really have an institution like that. The thing is that we still need spaces and mechanisms to create coordination of action when it comes to international issues. So sooner or later, these conversations will either be because we need a new institution or a reform because we know that this should be working better, or particularly, and the most worrying aspect is that when things really start crumbling, when peace and security internationally in a more widespread way, that brings the new motivation for countries to first, I think what we need to have at this stage, it is countries with courage to be able to call for a meeting revising the UN Charter. That is the first step. I think often what we get stuck with is that we've tried to figure out who are the countries that are going to be, we're going to have 2 seats for Africa or not. Countries like Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan be part of it. I don't think this is the most important thing. I think the most important thing here is that we need to find ways in which the international community is able to organize itself to find means and ways to respond to international crisis. And what it's clear at this stage is that the Security Council becomes less and less capable or willing to do so. And there is an importance for other parts of the world, even if not the P5 are not on board, to be able to continue with the pressure, to be able to continue with ideas that may make the Security Council more effective. Very difficult task, but important to be done.
But is what the United States is doing with or to President Maduro enough to give the nation of the world that space and that it needs to have that crucial conversation that you have just alluded to? In other words, is this the moment? If you cast your mind back to just over a month ago, the G20 and how the United States dealt with South Africa's presidency of the G20, some people felt that that was the moment which gave certainly the G20 nations, which are a very powerful bloc, an opportunity to begin to reimagine a world without the United States. So what I'm asking is, from that moment to this moment we're in, where President Maduro is in, being charged by the United States after having been kidnapped, but is this moment crucial enough to take that process a step further, and to allow the nations of the world to begin to interrogate the issues that you have raised in the manner that you reckon they should be tackled?
It's an important question, and I don't think it's enough, but it's certainly very symbolic in terms of what is the world that we live in the 2020s. The world that we live in the 2020s, it is a world that is much more unstable. There is a world where permanent members of the Security Council in powerful countries really see the UN, ignore the UN to a large degree, and are able to engage with action without any consequences or constraints. Okay. Now, I think what it does provide as an opportunity, it is to increase the volume of those voices. Those voices we've seen in General Assembly meetings in September for the last years, many countries starting to bring again these discussions. The last time we had a serious conversation about UN reform was exactly 20 years ago. So what I do hope that it does create, it is the incentive for countries that if we don't look seriously into the difficult conversations, these institutions that we've spent the last 8 years building is going to crumble even more.
Gustavo Carvalho from the South African Institute of International Relations. Let me thank you very much for your time.